Good morning, Ali.
Good morning, Ashu. How you doing?
I'm doing really well. It's good to have you here today.
Likewise, super excited.
Well, let's get started. I want to welcome Ali Godse, co-founder and CEO of Databricks, where I'm a seed investor to the FC Build conference. Ali is a PhD from the KTH Royal Institute of Technology from Sweden, who joined UC Berkeley in 2009 as a visiting scholar and worked closely with Scott Schenker, Jan Stoika, Matej Zaharia at the AMP Lab. He then co-founded Databricks with Jan and Matej in 2013, leading engineering and product management, and became the CEO in 2016. While Ali probably can't comment on valuation, I routinely get offers to buy my shares at north of 10 billion. And it's widely rumored that the company is going to go public sometime soon. Ali, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Ali, perhaps you can start by sharing the founding story of Spark and Databricks.
Yeah, happy to. It was really interesting because we were researchers at UC Berkeley, and it's a public university, has not that much funding. But the interesting thing is that Silicon Valley forward tech companies, the Facebooks, Googles of the world, they're interested in the talent at these universities. So they spent actually quite a bit amount of money at UC Berkeley in research, and most of it just to get closer to the smart talent. And that enabled us to basically get a glimpse into what they were doing under NDA, of course. Mm-hmm. And we got to see what they were doing, and they were doing things very, very differently. Okay, so they were using massive amounts of data, and they were using that data in a very strategic way to disrupt the industry that they were sort of competing with. You know, whether it was Facebook and the media industry, or Airbnb and the hotel industry, or Uber and the cab medallions, they were actually enabling their organization to use data across the organization. You know, hundreds of people, thousands of people using this data, and then they were coming up with various ways to optimize using machine learning, AI, and they were getting ahead of the competition that way. So, you know, we wanted to do the same thing, and we were Berkeley hippies. So we said, we'll open source what these guys are doing. They're confidentially, they're both proprietary stuff. We'll open source it. We'll give it to the world for free. And, all the enterprises on the planet can then do the same thing instead of just these few Silicon Valley forward tech companies. And that is that. And then we'll move on and we'll publish research papers and we'll be happy the rest of our lives.
But it turned out a little differently from research.
Yeah, I mean, what basically happened is that Ben Horowitz showed up in 2013 and kind of said, you guys are idiots. If you really want to, you're onto something, you got something good going here. But if you want to change the world, you can't expect other people to do it for you. You got to take that.
You have to do it yourself.
Yeah, you got to do it yourself. If you guys don't do it, nobody else is going to do it. So this is yours to lose. So that kind of got us thinking that, maybe we should, because, confidentially, I haven't shared this before, but we went and knocked on a bunch of companies' doors, companies like Cloudera and so on. And we said, we have this awesome technology. Why don't you take it? And they said, well, but you created it. Who's going to be governing it? And we said, look, we're academics. We don't want to make any money. You take it. You run with it. And they, nah, we don't want that. This is academic, mumbo jumbo. We don't really think that there is anything here. It's not enterprise ready. No, we're not interested. So, we were given the runaround for, probably 4 years across, Silicon Valley. We would go on 101. We would, we were poor, so we would rent a car. We'd go down on 101. We'd visit Facebook and all these places and say, please take this technology. And they didn't want it.
No one wanted it at the time.
Yeah.
Well, things for Cloudera have turned out a little differently compared to Databricks. So, it's amazing how big a deal Hadoop was at the time and what's happened since. But shifting gears from the founding story of Databricks, the company, perhaps, maybe you could talk a little bit about your story, which is so unique as well. Academia, growing up in Sweden, to UC Berkeley, to being a VP of engineering, and now eventually the CEO.
Yeah.
What are some of the highlights?
Yeah. So look, I actually think the way I think about these companies, they go in stages, right?
Yeah.
And in the first stage of Databricks, when I was the head of product, and I'll get to it in a second, you're really just focused on making sure that you have product market fit.
Yep.
And that's more important than anything else. So in some sense, the first part of my career prepared me for that, right? Mm-hmm. So what you do as a researcher in computer systems is you spend a lot of time trying to come up with technology that really works and people will adopt and use. In some sense, it's sort of a school where you learn how to get product market fit. These systems schools. So that's what I did first part of my life. I grew up in Sweden. We actually built a bunch of open source technology back there. But then I got the chance to just come visit UC Berkeley 1 year. And
the rest is history.
I got permission from my girlfriend at that time. And I said, look, 1 year. And it's okay, 1 year, you have to be back. So I spent 1 year here and it was so amazing. Like we started, Mesos, Spark, Tachyon, all these projects that were having a lot of impact. So, I said, hey, can I stay another year? And then, can I stay another year? Can I stay another year? And I think after 3 years,
that was 11 years ago.
Yeah, exactly. And after 3 years, I think she dumped me. But yeah, so then in 2013, we got this opportunity. But when we started Databricks, the first phase was the phase of really understanding the enterprise customer and understanding that, what we had built at UC Berkeley was not really a fit for enterprises. So it actually needs to be quite a bit adapted. So that's what we did the first 3 years. And then when I became CEO in 2016, that's when you actually, once you have the product market fit, this product is something the market wants and needs. Now you have to really spin up the go-to-market side. And this is oftentimes where they bring in a professional CEO from outside, which has also its downsides. That's when I transitioned. And, I was lucky that I had seen 2 startups earlier and I had done an MBA earlier in my career. So I had a little bit of preparation, but that's when we focus on the go-to-market side. And today, I would say we're past that go-to-market phase 2. Now Databricks is sort of in the scale, multi-product, optimizing, the whole sort of organization. When you have thousands of employees, operational efficiency and operational rigor is more important than anything else. So that's the phase we're in now.
That's a great articulation. I think these 3 phases of finding product market fit, figuring out a scalable, repeatable go-to-market, and then at some point you're scaling the organization around that go-to-market. One of the questions that founders ask me again and again, I probably get this question once a day, and there's no right answer, but I'm curious to get your perspective, is what is product market fit? How do you know you have it?
Yeah. Look, I think product market fit, there are lots of books you can read on how to get product market fit and so on. I think most of them are bullshit.
Which is why I'm asking you. You lived that the hard way. The early days weren't easy.
I will just say this, and I don't have people won't like this answer, but there's science and then there's art. How to scale a go-to-market machine, there's a science behind it. And there are people who have done it. If you read the right books and you hire the right people, you can do it. Operational efficiency, same thing. Product market fit is not science, it's an art. So it's like saying, how do I create Symphony 9? Like, tell me what do I need to do? Or I want to do a painting that's as beautiful as Mona Lisa. What do I need to do? Do I need to practice my, muscles in the arm, or do I need to listen to certain music to get in a certain mood? And, it's hard because it's humans on the other side that have to really love what you're creating. So I would just say, fast iteration cycle and trying it out and testing it is the key thing. We had an advantage. We had an unfair advantage at Databricks, which was when you're at UC Berkeley in a lab and you're working on many of these projects and you're funded to, do research on it, right? So you have many, many years to try it out. And there were probably hundreds of projects that were created in those years that I was at UC Berkeley. Most of them didn't have product market fit. The ones that had are the ones that, of course, we spun out and did.
Makes sense.
So in some sense, we get to cheat a little bit at these research labs. But I don't think there's a formula you need to follow.
And I think you're spot on. I think the trick to product market fit is you sort of sense it and you feel it when you have it. When one of my CEOs, Mo Darren, has used the expression, which is a very high bar, is when the average salesperson can sell the product to the average customer. But that's a very high bar. But I think when you start to feel like demand is coming and you're not having to push to get every customer to adopt the product, there's a certain point when that inflection point happens and you kind of know you have it.
Yeah.
I want to talk a little bit about the go-to-market, because you've talked multiple times. In fact, in the B2B as CEO podcast, you talked about how the number one challenge for technical founders is figuring out the go-to-market.
Yeah.
And you talked a lot about how it's more of a science.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about your journey in figuring out the go-to-market for Databricks?
Yeah, let me take a step back and just start by saying usually the movie goes as follows, and it's actually kind of a sad movie. It's technical startup founder, super technically deep, build this awesome thing. It has product market fit, able to get some revenue out of it, but not enough. The board gets, antsy, and and then they bring in. Then they say, look, we need to make a change. We need to change the CEO, and then they think, okay, what's broken? What are we trying to fix? Well, certainly these guys have the tech covered, right?
Yeah.
They're smart, but it's the revenue is not there. So let's parachute in a professional CEO. And then the board then naturally says, well, who would be really good at growing revenue? Well, some CEO, professional CEO, who's prior in their life either done sales or marketing, because that's what we want to grow.
Yep.
So that's the person that they hire. So that's usually what happens. And in my opinion, that's kind of, that grows the revenue in the next 2-3 years, but it'll actually usually be the death of the company, because those people don't actually understand products and they don't understand markets, how products work. So the company kind of loses its sense of direction. Unless you can keep the co-founders deeply engaged and working really well with the new CEO, and they can continue.
Which is very hard.
Yeah, it's hard, right? It's hard. That's a marriage, that, really needs to work out well from both sides. And, they really need to trust each other and be mature, and that's hard. In the rare cases where the tech guy like me gets a chance to actually do the go-to-market side, I think there's a few things you need to think about. It's not just, hey, there's a go-to-market thing, you just deploy it. You just need to get the pros, you do go-to-market, and then you're done. It's actually not that simple, because it depends on which market you're selling to, how they will buy, and who that persona is. And how do you get that budget from them? What's required to do that? That's different for different products. Actually, one of the mistakes we made at Databricks early days was that we thought, we'll let them swipe a credit card and then come do AI on our platform. And actually, that didn't happen.
Yeah, turn out enterprises don't like doing that.
Exactly. And even if they do, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Because here's the thing. Databricks builds AI, for enterprises. And this AI is extremely strategic for them. Okay? So strategic that they're happy to pay us millions of dollars. Okay? How do you get in any company on the planet $1 million approved to spend on anything? That's a big decision. It's not some engineer that's sitting there, coding, who swipes a credit card and just, puts $1 million on it. So enterprises, in our case, where the ASPs are higher, the average selling price is higher, and you need to have budget for this decision, and you need to get high up in the organization. That's a particular go-to-market, the enterprise sales motion that's needed for that. That's the muscle you need to build. And you don't get to just pick that. Like when you're a CEO, you don't just get to say, oh, I want my ASP to be $5 million, and I don't want to have any salespeople, and so on and so forth. You have to, for the product you have and the market that you want to address with it, you have to find the right go-to-market strategy for that. For Databricks, it ended up being enterprise sales. But if you take something like Alteryx or Tableau or many other products, it's different. It's get as many users as possible. Each license costs maybe $1,000, $2,000, and then once you have enough of those people in the organization, you can maybe consolidate it. Same thing with Slack. That's a different go-to-market motion. So you need a leader on the sales side that you need to hire that can understand. This first, it's almost like product market fit, but it's for the go-to-market side. Bootstrapping of the go-to-market side. So I think there are 3 phases on the go-to-market side. The first phase is to figure out how you're gonna,
what is the model? What's the price point? Who's the buyer? What's the persona? What their decision-making process is? So that's phase 1.
That's phase 1. And the person who does that is very creative sales go-to-market leader. And it's basically the 0 to 10 million story. This is the person that will take you to the 0 to 10. They're highly creative. They're actually really smart, and they're experimenting with you as a co-founder on how to do that. So that's phase number 1. Phase number 2, once you know that, okay, this thing sells, now we just need to hire people. There's the growers. The growers, they're really good about how to put we need sales ops, we need this ratio of, sales engineers and this and that, and they'll configure it for scale. Okay. And then the third phase is the, optimizers or the maximizers. This is
extracting the value.
Yeah, at that point, it's, how do you drive efficiency out of it? Because it's a very costly affair. Go-to-market can be extremely costly. You can burn down your whole bank account, literally, and many, many founders have. So how do you actually optimize that is going to be essentially one of the most important things you do to get to profitability. So that's a different leader. So you need to so when you're a technical co-founder, you need to find that pairing of a go-to-market leader that can
at
take
every stage.
0 to 10. Now, it might be one, you find the, genius that can do the whole thing for you, but it's usually not the case.
No, I think you make a really good point. I mean, a lot of technical CEOs get paired up with the scale go-to-market leader way too early. And I think, as you rightly pointed out, you want someone who actually is creative enough to try a half a dozen different approaches, who can try a bottom-up, middle-out. I mean, there's all these different go-to-market approaches, and you don't actually know which one will work. And so I think having that flexibility in the first, 100 customers or so is really critical.
Yeah, and I would also say, a lot of founders sort of ask me, is my sales guy doing the right stuff or not? I'm saying, hey, you should be there with them because you really know stuff.
Yep.
You should get in there and actually do the sell with them. So it's almost like figuring out product market fit, the same thing again, but mostly for the go-to-market motion. So get in there and you should be selling to the customers yourself as a technical co-founder all the time with your go-to-market leader until you guys figured out the messaging, the persona, who you're targeting, how you get that budget, the pitch, all of that.
Absolutely. Ali, I'm going to move around a little bit. There's been a bunch of audience questions around the business model, especially for open source projects. And Databricks is, in fact, a rare example of a company that started off with Spark, one open source project. You built a very successful business model while continuing to support Spark as a project. And now you have several other open source projects that that are part of the fold and the family. Can you talk a little bit about your business model and how that's evolved?
Yeah. So first of all, I think there's two different classes of open source business models. One is what I call the Red Hat open source model.
Yep.
Is I have some free software, I give that to you, and you need my support and services around it to be successful. Okay, so it's generally a services business model.
Yep.
That business model works if you're so lucky, like Red Hat, that there's really no major competition. As we saw with Hadoop and many other technologies, oftentimes because it's free, you'll find 3, 4, 5 vendors that come in and say, hey, we'll offer that as well. So that's a difficult business model. And eventually, as you move on, it's going to be hard because it's difficult to, monetize just support and services. Over time, there will be people that can do support and services better and cheaper than you. And over time, this expertise that you have for the tech that you created becomes commoditized as it becomes.
The value continues to decline over time.
Exactly. The other business model that I think people don't think about enough, but it's like obvious and it's in front of their face, it's the 800-pound gorilla, is the SaaS open source model. Okay. And just to be provocative, I'll say that one of the best companies on the planet is Amazon Web Services in terms of running that business model. That's a business model in which you take open source software and you say, hey, you can rent it from me and you pay me rent for using the service. It's much stickier, okay, than the on-prem open source model where they could switch services provider who does support for them. They could switch from, say Cloudera to a Hortonworks, very easily and keep the software. That's the key thing. They could keep the software. In the cloud, when you're renting the service from AWS or Databricks or anyone else, you can't keep the software if you want to switch vendors. You have to give this, it ceases to work. So that business model is much, much better. Why? It's stickier and it's harder to switch to other things. And it turns out over time, this subscription model grows the revenue in a much more sort of sustainable way.
Totally makes sense. And if I can interrupt for a second, because the audience has been engaging in this and asking the next level of detail. The challenge with that open source model, with the SaaS model, is that you're now often competing with the cloud service providers themselves.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about how do you dance with the elephants?
Yeah. I mean, let me go back to what I was saying about the on-prem and the cloud. Just because some people are confused, there are vendors that are doing open source and they started with this Red Hat model. okay? And the truth is they're not very good at running a SaaS service in the cloud. So once their customer base told them that, look, we need to be in the cloud, they said, oh, okay, we'll offer, I created this software, I'll run it in the cloud. The problem is when they start running in the cloud, they realize, wow, it's really, really hard to run a SaaS service.
Yep.
At that point, the cloud vendors are running super fast and taking their software and offering it up. And actually, they're offering a better service than the open source creators. So my advice is this. If you start a company on open source now, you need to be 100% in the cloud. And you need to be 100% SaaS. Don't touch on-prem, okay? Get really good at managing SaaS software in the cloud. If you do that, then I think you can absolutely compete and beat the cloud vendors. Databricks is an example of that, because it's actually really hard to operate and run software in the cloud. And who do you think is the best in the world to operate that software? The creators, So like Databricks has a competitive advantage when it comes to operating things like MLflow, things like Delta, things like Spark. The technologies we created, no one can run them as well at scale, reliably, and cheaply than us. The cloud vendors cannot do that. We literally are creating the technology for that. Had we started on-prem, though, that would not have been true, because on-prem, we would have gone really good at this support and services thing. And then 5-6 years later, we would have tried to just, maybe we should just offer something in the cloud. Then it turns out it's very hard. So I think that's what's really going on. So I say you can compete with them. These guys have their hands full running VMs, data centers, storage, and a lot of other things. They're not going to be world-class at operating your open source software that you invented, if you focus on it. But you have to focus on it, and it's not easy.
So I think clearly the message hopefully the audience is hearing from you is don't have one foot each in two boats. You've got to commit 100% to being on the cloud first. You've got to commit to being a SaaS service provider from day one. And it's often very different from the ethos of an open source project community, because, those projects are really around improving the project, and, adding features, adding functionality, adding integrations. And now you have to build a whole new engineering culture around running a cloud service.
Yeah.
And presumably, you end up building a lot of proprietary software in that process.
You have to. Here's a dirty secret that nobody thinks about. To my knowledge, every open source project is an on-prem product. You go download it from GitHub, there's a version number. You download it, there's an installer, you install it. That's shrink-wrapped software. That's not a SaaS service. SaaS service, like if you use Databricks today, you don't even get to see the version. It gets upgraded all the time under the scene and so on. So in some sense, it's two different technologies. One is a SaaS service. The other one is shrink-wrapped, gets released X times a year, software. So yeah, by definition, you're actually, if you have an open source project and you also have a SaaS service, the SaaS service is actually a different thing. And a lot of the secret sauce can be there in how to manage and operate and run it. And that, it doesn't even make sense open sourcing that. There is no open source, I don't think there's an open source version of MongoDB or pick your favorite Cassandra, pick your favorite open source project. I don't think there exists a SaaS version of it in open source.
Got it. And so those are two engineering teams that you have to build, and two sort of engineering shipping motions inside the company that you have to support over time.
Yeah, but put your weight behind the SaaS one, because that one is revolutionary different. It's fundamentally at its core very different from how you do R&D on-prem. It's at its core. It's fundamentally different in sort of 5 different ways. So it's impossible to just figure that out later.
Yeah. Is there any other advice, before we move on, change topics, is there any other advice you have for founders who are, building companies around open source projects? Anything else, in terms, because you've done now this with a couple of different open source projects. Yeah.
I think once, ultimately you can't be a one-trick pony. So ultimately you will be a multi-product company. We don't go around today and thinking Google is an amazing company because they have this search algorithm called PageRank. That's why they are great. No, nobody thinks of that way, right? So if you're going to be successful, you're going to transcend this one project that you're starting now. So keep that in mind. And don't tie yourself too closely just to one tech. This is something we did at Databricks early days. When we started Databricks, we said, hey, our original invention was Spark at that time. These days, it's a small portion of what we do. But back then we were saying, should we name the company something with Spark? And as founders, we said no, because we will transcend Spark. We will have a whole portfolio of products eventually, and Spark will be just one of them. And now in hindsight, it was really important because today, the most important open source project we have, I would say, is Delta. So that's a cautionary tale. There are companies out there, where, for instance, Docker, the company, and Docker, the software is the same thing. Like it's same name.
And it constrained them.
Yeah.
It boxed them for a long time.
Yeah. So this is just psychological advice to my fellow co-founders. Eventually you'll have to divorce yourself from that open source project you created if your company is going to be successful.
I think that's great advice, and it's one that you have to make that decision very early on. So thanks for sharing that. The audience has been asking a lot of follow-up questions on your insights around go-to-market. So if you don't mind, I'm going to take you back to that for a couple of questions, and then we can come back to some broader questions. So one of the questions coming from the audience from Greg is, in the $0 to $10 million phase, as you're figuring out your go-to-market, do you recommend that you have just one go-to-market leader, or should you have a separate leader for sales and a separate one for marketing?
Yeah, actually, most VCs will give you advice that you first hire the product marketing leader because they come up with the marketing material, because the sales guy doesn't know what to say otherwise, and then you hire the sales guy. I actually disagree with them, and I think you should do it in the reverse order. Titles don't really matter, but I think you need a partner in crime that essentially is going to be your GTM co-founder of yours. And that person might join several years later once you have product fit. And whoever that is, together with that person, you're going to figure it out with him or her. Maybe that person has a marketing title, but most likely they have a sales title. Most likely they're on the sales side. Because really what you're doing in that phase is you're going to the customer and you're basically giving them a value prop and putting a price tag on it.
Yep.
Okay, and you're going to see if it sticks. And, so you experiment with different stakeholders, with different types of companies, and you're doing this while you're changing the value prop, you're changing the product a little bit to see, maybe it's a different product I should. So you need a thought partner that knows that. I think that's the salesperson. Once you have that figured out, that I think I know what it is. This is roughly this value prop, but probably the way I explain it is way too complicated. And it's typically this persona, and, this is roughly what the product looks like. That's when I think you bring in a marketing leader. And, I would say there's basically two different types of marketing leaders for that stage of the company. There's the messaging people, and then there's the demand gen people. The demand people can drive demand. And then there's the messaging people. They love the story, the narrative. They can tell you a nice story. My opinion is you hired that person, the storyteller, that then takes your super complicated, technically correct message and makes it really available to a wide audience so that it resonates with a big audience. And most importantly, that you can actually teach it to a sales guy in Texas who doesn't care about your company. He's going to work there 1 or 2 years to make some money and leave. You want that guy who has, he's not going to kill himself. You want him to be able to quickly pick up that message and run with it. That's the second hire, is that marketing leader. The third hire, I think, should be the finance leader. Because if you don't hire a finance leader, the go-to-market leaders will, as I mentioned earlier, empty your bank account.
And the wheels start to fall off.
So you don't want to, as a CEO, spend all your time all day long micromanaging where they're spending the money and why are you paying 350 KOT to the sales guy and so on. You don't want to. You shouldn't be doing that. Have a professional CFO whose job is to make sure that you still have money in the bank account.
I think that sequence makes a lot of sense. So it's hire a salesperson or sales leader that is creative, that has a business development bone in their body, that can help you figure out the go-to-market. Then bring on board a marketing person to scale that approach. And I think you rightly pointed out that, there's so many different skills in marketing. You have to pick one to hire for first, one spike. And the spike is around storytelling. Yes. And then they can build demand gen around them. And then once these people start spending some money, some serious money, you need the finance person to come in and sort of corral them a little bit.
Yeah, and here's why the marketing one, just to make that point. How many startups do you guys know where you go to their webpage and you're like, but I don't know exactly what they do. What do they do? And you talk to the, founder and they say, oh, it's very simple. We take Docker and we have a KVM layer. We modify the Linux kernel in which we can actually do the virtual operations really, really fast. Well, what do you exactly do? So that's why you need that. Those companies are in dire need of product marketing storyteller.
I completely agree. We have these panels sometimes, and I remember the last panel we did, we had 8 CEOs who all described their companies. So we're all in one space, and security is an example in this case. And it sounded that like all the 8 companies did the same thing.
Yeah.
And they actually did 8 different things.
Yeah.
But the storytelling is, because if you abstract it to too high a level, it's meaningless.
Yeah.
And if it's too detailed, no one understands.
Yeah.
And finding that right abstraction, I think, is challenging.
Yeah, absolutely.
On the go-to-market side, another thread that's been coming through in the questions from the audience has been around pricing. You talked early on about, how customers are willing to pay you millions of dollars, and you said you've got to just try a lot of things. You've got to throw things at the wall and see what sticks. Any other observations on pricing beyond that?
Yeah, we should do a whole separate podcast just on pricing. So I think it's an extremely important topic. When people say product market fit, I see that as part of product is pricing. It's one of the 4 Ps of marketing product, actually, in general. So I think you need to take it super seriously. I have actually run a product pricing meeting since we started Databricks every week. Still till this day, 7 years in, and we still run it
every week.
Every week. It's called PGTM, pricing go-to-market meeting, and it's every week, an hour and a half. Since the start, I'm not saying you have to do that, and otherwise you're not going to get pricing.
Right, it's a good different trick. So for every CEO, at least run it for a couple of years and see what happens.
It's a very important topic. It's especially as your company is a little bit bigger. You don't need to be thousands of employees. Even if you're just 50 people or 100 people, it's actually a tricky thing to change, because the sales guy will say, "Well, you just ruined my revenue," and the marketing guy needs to know how to actually market that price. The product guys need to build it into the product, right? So there's so many stakeholders involved. Finance, so you actually, the only one who can really pull that together and make sure that you get the right pricing structure initially in the early days is the CEO, in my opinion. Sales leader can't do it unilaterally. Finance can't do it unilaterally. Product guys don't have enough influence to just push that out. What I would say is you should have WTP discussions, willingness to pay discussions with your customers. You should ask them what they're willing to pay. You should price on a metric that's attached to the value that the customer is getting. So attached to whatever is the thing that really ultimately defines the value. And ideally, it's something that grows or has multiple growth drivers behind it: users, data, hours spent, whatever it is, impressions, so that your revenue can grow faster than, say, the number of users just using it, if you can attach to such a growth driver. And you're going to have people that are going to come say, "Hey, we can't price it on that value metric, because if we do that, it prohibits growth." Mm-hmm. Don't listen to them, because if you pick the right pricing metric, if you're really pricing on value, of course people will optimize that particular metric. Your customers will try to lower that. And yes, it prevents that very thing. If you think users is the main thing you should price on, of course, if you price on that, you won't get as many users, because every user has to pay. But it's still the right metric. So I would say do that. There are a lot of firms out there that can help you with, consultancies out there, that can help you with doing the willingness to pay conversation. So I also think you should use them. I've used many of them over the years. It
sounds like you've put a lot of energy behind pricing.
I think it's extremely important. I think if you look at technology space in the last 40, 50 years, many of the way companies disappeared or appeared or won or products won just came down to pricing. Like how Office bundled its software versus Lotus 123 or WordPerfect, or how big companies buy the second player in the market that's not so good and offer it as a free SKU as part of their enterprise agreement. It's all bundling pricing strategies. So I would definitely spend a lot of energy and time on pricing.
One last question on this go-to-market phase, and then we'll move on. Someone from the audience Karthik from the audience is asking the question that, if you're a solo technical founder, you were relatively lucky. I think there were several of you. But if you're a solo technical founder and you're building something relatively hard, some deep tech just like you were, how do you balance between product development and go-to-market, especially at the earliest stages? When you maybe raise a couple of $1 million in the seed, you don't have $8 or $10 million in the bank. It feels like it's a hard balance every day.
Yeah, it's difficult. I mean, for me, I think focus on product market fit, which is make sure that the thing you're building has value. I think it's just too hard to build the perfect company according to a playbook, step by step. So if you try to in seed A, build the right product for the right TAM, make sure that the willingness to pay is really high, and that it's just too many things to optimize. at the same time. So I think stage number one, just make sure that this product actually has unique value that's at least 10x more than anything else that's out there for them. Are you just a nice to have or a 10, 20%, improvement over the existing? Yeah. Are you a vitamin or are you a painkiller? I forget to take my vitamins every day. That's how important they are. But when I have a headache, I need my painkiller. Okay. So are you a painkiller and are you a 10x painkiller? That's better than anything out there. Focus on figuring that out. Once you have that painkiller, you can figure out, that's when you can start focusing on the go-to-market side. There's lots of examples, companies like Facebook, Google, Snapchat, WhatsApp, who, I don't think really had figured out their go-to-market strategy. They just had a viral.
But they got amazing consumer demand. Yeah.
And investors invested in them and said they'll figure it out, and they did.
I want to shift gears back to sort of where Databricks is today. Which is a very different company from some of the early days that we've talked about, and where a lot of the founders who are listening to this are. You mentioned a few minutes ago that while you started with Spark, Delta has become the most important open source project in your ecosystem. Can you talk about your journey from being a point product to a platform for data scientists, and now today you're a platform serving the needs of multiple user persona, including business analytics users?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's similar to our story. We wanted to, when we were at Berkeley, product market fit stage, we just wanted to build something way better, 10x better at least. And actually we came up with something that was roughly 100 times faster than Hadoop. That's the mindset. But once you have that and you start the go-to-market muscle and you start listening to these enterprises, our vision was we wanted to enable these enterprises to do the kind of AI and data science that is super strategic and disruptive to their markets, like Uber had, or Airbnb had, or Facebook had, or Google had. And we start working closer with them. It turns out that Spark itself is not enough. It's pretty complicated, and you need actually several pieces of the puzzle. So my advice then is at that point, and it's very natural, you see many, many companies doing this, you start looking at what's the critical user journey, or what's the jobs to be done. You can Google those two phrases.
Yeah.
What's the jobs to be done, or this critical user journey that a user has to go through to be successful with the job they want to achieve. You're usually just a part of that. Spark is part of that. Most companies are just a small part of that, right? Is there a way you can consolidate that? You can expand that so you can own end-to-end more of that. If you can, that kind of vertical integration, you can give benefits that no one else can. Because at the seams between those product jumps that everyone has to do, there's a lot of friction, a lot of cost, different buyers. So if you could do multiple of those, you can have a much superior experience as a user goes through that critical user journey to do the job that they need to get done. Whatever it is, like I need to come up with a predictive model to reduce fraud on my site. What do I need to do step by step? So Databricks today, now what it has is Spark is a way where you get all your data into a data lake.
Yep.
That's just the foundation of accessing all the data that's virtualized in this data mesh everywhere. Once you have that data, Delta is the technology that actually puts quality, reliability, and performance on it so that data is usable by anyone in the organization. Now you have governance on your data, it's secure. Then we have on top of that something called ML Flow, which enables you to do end-to-end machine learning and data science on that data. And now we've also built something that we just announced a month ago, which is SQL Analytics, which enables you to do the data warehousing workloads, BI and other SQL-based workloads. That now covers the end-to-end journey that typically an organization has to go through to be successful with their data. But for your company, whoever you are, that journey is a different one. It's not the one I mentioned. But think it through in terms of what's the end-to-end journey that they have to go through to be successful. How many steps are there? Are there ones where you would have a competitive advantage if you could do two of them in one platform? Could you do it better because I don't need to switch between two products with different formats and different ways of connecting them and integrating them? And is there a way you can do that better? That could be huge competitive advantage for you. And enterprise will want to buy that because enterprises today are sort of inundated with complicated software stacks with 4 data warehouses and 5 copies of this and 8 copies of that, and it's very hard to govern and manage all of that. So they are always open to if you could consolidate a few.
Simplification, yeah. I think that's a good segue, in fact, to another question that's been coming in on the machine learning tooling space, which is what you're doing is sort of, much broader in many ways, but the machine learning tooling space in recent years has become very complicated with lots of startups. There's startups for building models, startups for testing models, startups for hosting models, producing, putting them into production. And at the same time, every major tech vendor, including the 3 cloud service providers, also has its own ML tooling platform. So do you have any specific advice for founders starting companies in this category?
Yeah, I mean, one is, I think multi-cloud is the future. And we're even seeing it, even the cloud vendors, some of them are now releasing, I think, Google released the BigQuery Omni, which is BigQuery should work on other, there are Anthos and so on. And you'll see that from the other cloud vendors too.
Yep.
So that's an advantage you have on your side, which is multi-cloud will be a thing. And a particular cloud service that only works on that cloud is going to actually eventually become a huge disadvantage for that cloud vendor. It isn't today, but eventually it will become. So that's a good silver lining. Second, I think the higher up the stack you move, the less competition you will see from the cloud vendors. The reason is this. The cloud vendors are starting with storage, compute, and networking. And they have to nail that. They can't lose that war, right? But that's only 3-4 things, 3 core ingredients. On top of that, you can actually build many more things. And on top of that, even more, right? So the tree structure just explodes above it.
Yeah.
Right? And you move 2-3 levels up, now there's like literally thousands of apps or tens of thousands of apps. The cloud vendors won't be able to do all of that.
So it's moving up the abstraction. Yeah.
So every hop you move up in the sort of software stack, it's going to be harder for them to dominate all of that. So that would be my advice. I would, this is not categorical, but I'm a little bit worried for people that are straight up in the core storage or network, in the very that you should probably assume that the cloud vendors will nail, because there's 3 of them, they have infinite funding, and that's literally the only thing they're supposed to do. It's not
important. You really do have infinite funding, especially with the way the market, the stock market is going these days.
Exactly.
But Ali, we're starting to wrap up now. I think we're on the hour close to. I want to wrap up maybe with one last question for you. As you take a step back on what has been a remarkable journey over the last decade, what's perhaps the one insight or the single biggest lesson you have when you look back? And if you were giving the 10-year younger version of Ali advice, what would you tell Ali who's 10 years younger?
Yeah, I mean, I would tell him a few things. One is cliche, but the other one I think people might like hearing. The first one I would say is that focus on people that you can trust and finding leaders that you can trust. It's very hard, right? It's these kind of marriages, finding the people that you can work together really, really closely and figure this stuff out. There aren't enough of them. And, even if you figured out the 3-4 people that you work well with now, in 2 years or 3 years, when you reach the next stage of your company, who's going to be the next person to do that there? So, spend much more time on that, much earlier, and building trust with those. The second thing that I would say that, I would focus on much more these days than I did in the past 10 years is I would be more on compromising in the sense that, there's a lot of shortcuts you can take to get revenue. Don't do them. The boards will push you. You want to hit those revenue numbers, but just don't do it. If you're building for a vision of the cloud, just do that. For instance, at Databricks, we built a cloud platform, but then I approved one exceptional deal, which was on-prem, just one. There was only one of them. And, it just took so much energy from me and the people involved and, supporting it. Don't take shortcuts like that. It wasn't worth it. Now,
focus.
Build that thing.
Be relentless and focused.
Yeah. The third thing I would say is just, if I look back at the person 10 years ago is, trust yourself much more. There's a lot of herd behavior. Everybody runs in that direction, but nobody's like, hey, but who's leading us in that direction? And I don't know. We're all running this way. Let's go. Think from first principles and stick by it and believe in yourself. And if you think big enough, you might be able to actually pull it off. So have confidence. That's probably the 3 things I would tell myself.
That's super helpful, Ali. Thank you so much for joining us today. And to everyone out there, Thank you so much as an audience. You've been great in terms of asking questions. We have so many more questions that we didn't get to, but maybe we'll do another podcast. So thank you, Ali, and thank you everyone else. We're going to wrap this one up now.